Let me just make sure it's going to work.
We appreciate what you're doing.
Does it work here? Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure mine works. I know, dang it. All right, so today we're going to talk about World War II, and it's a global conflict, and that's, remember, IB, we're talking about the world, and you know, and how, you know, it's not just U.S. history, it's world history at this point here. So, and what I did is I have a couple of photos in here, because I always think I like to do that to kind of get you thinking about what the war is going to be like. So, obviously the war in Europe, we usually think of Hitler and the Nazis and what they're doing to cause the war. Over here in the South Pacific, it's more, this is one of the most famous pictures from the Pacific Theater, and that's the raising of a flag at Iwo Jima, a very small island that saw the death of many, many, many men. Here, you're going to see that women had a completely different role, and what becomes of women prior to the war and what happens to them after the war is going to be very different. And again, from here, it's going to spring more into a lot of the different movements we have when it comes to like feminism, women working outside of the homes, and just changing their gender roles. And then up here, I have the Tuskegee Airmen, because you're going to see that a lot of African-American, black soldiers went off to war, and they fought, and when they come home, this time they're not going to go back and be as silent when they come back into society. They're going to be much more vocal in what they do. And many of these men, I'm not saying these men specifically, but a lot of the black excuse me, soldiers from World War II are going to get the GI Bill. And that GI Bill is going to allow them to go to college. It's going to allow them to get educated in ways that they've never been educated before. And now they can become doctors, lawyers, businessmen, so they not only have the ability to look at the law and understand the law and change the law, but they now have people who can help finance that changing of the law. So this all fits into what you guys do with your civil rights movement. So if you're looking at it, you can talk about it swelling up again from World War I and through, okay? Any questions on that?
What does GI stand for?
GI, government issued.
Also, like government issued Joe?
Yeah, that's GI Joe, that's what it means, government issued Joe. So, as you can see here, causes of World War II, they can be pretty complex when we look at it, okay? So, as we're looking at this here, you know, when we look at Europe, Europe is going to come out of World War I completely devastated, completely destroyed in many ways, economically, physically, the land, and so forth. And what happens is the treaty that comes out of it, Versailles, remember that? So the Versailles Treaty is what, when we're talking about all of the treaties made, we're always talking about Versailles, but we know there were some others. But it's going to leave Europe really unstable. Why? Because it doesn't really settle a peace the way it should have. It left a lot of minorities in other territories. They've been pulled from other countries. It's upside down. The other thing that we have to look at is the failure of collective security in the Great Depression. What's collective security? Do you remember?
It's like when everyone chips in and like protects other countries.
Right, so it's the League of Nations, when all the nations were supposed to work together to stop a bully, if you want to look at it that way, another country from pushing another country around, stopping it so it doesn't turn into a big war like they had in World War I. And at the same time, we're also looking at, you know, the policies of Hitler, and we're going to see that Hitler is, you know, basically one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why war starts in Europe. So here would be some essay questions to consider that might be seen on your exam. For example, like, you know, why did collective security fail to keep the peace between 1920 and you know, the 35? To what extent was the League of Nations doomed to fail? We talked about that last one. To what extent was World War II Hitler's war, and so forth? What was the policy of appeasement? So we're going to look at some of these topics here today, okay? Have you guys heard of some of these at least? Yes, okay. So far, just a good overview for you? All right, good. That's what I want to hear, okay? So, let's do this. I got it. Yeah, I'm good. Yep. So, some of the long-term causes and the reasons for failure of the security, collective security in the 1930s. What happens here is the Great Depression. What do you guys know about the Great Depression?
Time of severe economic, what's the word? I guess recession.
not just a recession, that would be okay. Depression is even worse. It was so severe that unemployment rates around the world are going to jump into the 30%. If you go back to here in America, if you go back to when we had the pandemic here a couple years ago, and unemployment was running around 10%. That seemed like a lot, right? Imagine tripling that, okay, with no recovery in sight. So that's gonna lead to some of the unstable or instability of Europe and the world. The U.S. became a global dominant economic power. When World War I ends, basically, instead of London being the economic center, it becomes New York and Wall Street. That's going to be new, and I'm not sure America was quite ready for that. Because the United States doesn't really get out there and stay in the world and help when there's problems out there, what happens is a lot of the world starts turning back to national self-interest. Instead of working together collectively, they start going, what's best for me? What's best for our nation, and so forth. And out of this eventually is going to become some strong military forces. And we'll see this, especially as you move on more in the late 20s and then into the 30s, in Germany, and then you look into Japan, and so forth. And Russia will be building up their military as well. Again, Europe is just a very, there's just so many, think about this. Imagine if you were driving across the United States and every time you went into a new state, it was like going into a new country with their own thoughts, beliefs, currency, language, and everything else. That would be very difficult to do, and there'd be a lot of competing elements for certain things. That's what Europe is like. I mean, you think about it, it's very similar to that. So there's it's unstable. Japan is going to be vulnerable. They're going to become a democratic nation, but it's not going to last very long, and you're going to see the military takes over there. And then a lot of the governments were blamed for the crisis that took place because they said, you governments here in these countries, you basically helped start World War I, and now it's led to these horrible economic times. So far, so good. We got this? All right. I'm going to stop looking at this thing because it's driving me nuts. I'm better looking back at the screen. Did I go too far? No. So, here's another reason for the failure of collective security is people were afraid of the Soviet Union, the Red Scare. There's a Red Scare in the 50s, but there's also a Red Scare in the 20s. And that Red Scare was, they looked at unionized people and said, anytime you were unionizing, it's like working together as communists. And there was right for it, because there were communists and socialists in a lot of these unions, but to some degree, they took it a step too far. So there was definitely a huge push to stop any kind of communism whatsoever. And what they were also afraid of is if you're poor and you're working class, and I'm coming to you going, hey, we're going to get rid of these powerful rich people who don't care about you, follow us, that would be very appealing, correct? Absolutely. And the Soviets had great propaganda. A lot of the British and French colonies after World War I start looking for freedom. Indochina, which becomes Vietnam. They're going to look for freedom. You're going to have India starting to look for freedom. So you got all of these nations or these colonies that are going to want their own independence. The United States is going to go back into isolationism and go, you know what, we got involved in your war, we're done, we're coming back, we're taking care of ourselves, we don't have to worry about Canada, don't have to worry about Mexico, nobody to our east, nobody to our west, we're good, we're just going to stay out of it, we just want to trade and make money. That's what we're going to go back basically and do.
That didn't
Now,
last long.
what's that?
That didn't last long.
Well, it will from about 1920 to about 1940, but then we'll come back out after that. And appeasement is going to be a policy that it becomes so popular, and it's just a realistic way. Instead of like trying to get every country to work together. Think about Russia right now. Everybody's trying to get people to work together to go against the Russians. Is it easy? No. So it's easier sometimes as a nation to just deal with the problem yourself because you can handle your own self-interest as opposed to the whole world. And this kind of is going to undermine the League of Nations. Good? All right. Sometimes you guys look at me like I got 3 heads. There we
You
go.
have 3 minutes?
What's that?
You don't have?
No, I don't, no. So,
Sorry.
what's going to happen here is we're going to look at a couple of the disputes. I talked about them last time in the last video. One of them is in Manchuria, and another one is going to be in Abyssinia, which is in Africa. So basically, what's going to happen here is Japan comes out of World War I fairly strong, as opposed, because the Chinese government just isn't, the population just isn't working. They're just not gelling. So they don't have a lot of stability. Japan comes out and wants to be kind of the leader of the Far East, what we would call, or Southeast Pacific sphere. And so what happens is, they see that if they don't extend their empire, they can't survive economically. Is there a lot of resources in Japan? No, not if you're going to be a powerful nation. There just aren't enough. So they have to expand. When they do that, they will go into Manchuria, which was in mainland China, and basically, through a series of things that kind of plant a bomb, make it explode, and then blame the Chinese. It's good. People are good at doing that. Okay? It's called the, anybody know what kind of flag that is?
Red flag.
Not a red flag, black flag. And what that means is, what it means is like you actually do the deed, but blame somebody else, so then you get the sympathy. It happened in the war in Kosovo in the 1990s. They actually bombed their own hospital, took pictures of it, and blamed the other side, and the whole world's like, oh my God. It's a smart thing to do. So they came in, they conquered this province, and the League of Nations had to go, well, what do we do? Japan's a League member, China's a League member. How do we settle this? This was a dilemma that they weren't ready for, okay? Oh, I'm sorry, there we go. I'm trying. So, the Manchurian dispute. So why is the League going to fail in this area here? Well, first of all, you've got the Great Depression. That's, that's full-fledged right now. I mean, people are worried about feeding their nations, clothing their people. They're waiting for their basic needs. They don't really have time to deal with other people's problems or other nations' issues. Okay? You're going to get everybody to send military troops there? Not an easy thing to do. It's hard to rally countries to do that. France and Italy are just way occupied with what's happening within Europe, and they're trying to get their, their regimes going. So the significance of this is the League of Nations just didn't have the will or the ability to follow through with the collective security. There's just no way for them to do this. And at this point here, they're going to look at the Far East, the Southeast Pacific, and go, we can't do anything about that. Whatever happens there, happens there. It's around the world. It doesn't impact us as much. We're going to be okay. That's their thought pattern, not realizing that what's happening to the globe. It's shrinking. And, as we go, think about it now. I mean, you could call somebody on the phone and, talk to them face to face that, in China. But, at that time you couldn't. But the globe is getting smaller. But they're still thinking that it's, there's Europe, and then there's everybody else, okay? And last but not least, they also have to start dealing with Mussolini, because Mussolini is the new leader since the early 20s in Italy, and he's becoming very aggressive, okay? Questions so far on any of this? No? So, what is the Abyssinian crisis? So here's the Abyssinian crisis, okay? So, here's Eritrea, and here's what's called Italian Somalia. So these two areas were controlled by the Italians, part of their colony system. They wanted to come in and basically connect these two regions, and so they, instead of having to travel through a foreign land, they would basically be traveling through their own territory, their own colonies. And what happens is when they do this, Mussolini, they invade, and basically England and France are the two main members of this League of Nations at this point. Russia, not really there involved. The United States is not involved. So basically, if Britain and France don't do anything, Mussolini believes it's okay. So, you know, he kind of goes along with it. What happens is, when they go in there, they are very brutal and nasty to the people. It's really a superpower beating up a non-superpower. Not that Italy was a superpower, but in comparison they were. And Haile Selassie, he is going to appeal to the League of Nations and say, hey, come on, somebody's got to help. We're in this league. I thought we were here to stop any kind of aggression like this. So eventually what will happen is Italy will be condemned and they will be forced to pay reparations or sanctions. Does that really matter? Not necessarily. It's not going to hurt them that much because they're going to look to a friend just to their north, which is going to be Germany. Okay? England and France will basically settle what's called the Hoare-Laval Pact. Those are the two ministers of basically of England and France, and they'll come up with this. Basically, the sanctions are meaningless. They didn't, put any oil sanctions on the Italians. That's one way you stop them. They didn't stop them from using the Suez Canal. So at the end of the day, the sanctions just don't work. And so Mussolini's just going to look at this and say, I can continue to expand. What is Hitler doing at this point also in Europe?
He's starting to test the waters.
He is. He's starting to rearm. He's starting to remilitarize the Rhineland. So as he's doing his thing, Mussolini's doing his thing, and what's happening is nobody's really doing anything. And so the more you can get away with something, the more you what? You do it. Absolutely. So, why is this horrible for the League of Nations? Well, obviously, nobody did anything. I mean, basically, they allowed another member to be beat up by another member. They did nothing. There was no collective security. Okay? It shows that the powers, these League of Nation powers, don't have the will to stand up and to protect each other, to help one another. However, Italy will become more isolated, which is good and bad, because they will move now much closer to Germany, especially because fascism, which is the two countries' style of government, are more in union with each other. And at this point here, the League of Nations is there in name only. Yes?
Wasn't the sanctions on Italy almost like as disastrous for Britain and France because of their economic issues and the fact that only they were doing it and not a lot of others were doing it as well?
Absolutely. Understand, sanctions sometimes, you're trying to hurt the other country, but you hurt yourself. For example, just use modern day. We just put sanctions on the Russians. Those sanctions are hurting us because we sanctioned their usage of where they can sell their oil and natural gas. Well, because they're now not being able to sell that to, like, say, the West or the United States, what's that helping to do to our prices of oil and gas? You guys have been to the pump, right? Don't you love $5 gas? $5 gallon gas? I don't either. So, now we're going to take a look at Hitler real quick. So Hitler's going to come in, and we know this, we talked about this, he wants to revise Versailles. He's like, that treaty was a stab in the back, it was a diktat, it was a dictated peace. He's never going to be stopped. By the time when they're ready to stop him, it's too late. They're going to follow appeasement, and I did talk a lot about this in the last PowerPoint. So again, we're looking at some of the short, and do you guys know a lot of this so far, or is this helping? No, I mean, so far what we've done.
So far?
It's all pretty clear.
All right, good, all right. So what's going to happen now, because again, Italy's becoming more isolated, and in a sense, Germany's not isolated, but they're definitely starting to push others' potential friends and allies away. They're going to have the Rome-Berlin Access Treaty signed in October of '36, which is going to eventually lead to, when Japan signs it and so forth, you're going to have more or less the triple axis, and that's where you're going to have Germany, Italy, and Japan working together. How do you remember that as an alliance? G.I. Joe. Germany, Italy, Japan. It's a war. G.I. Joe, that's how you remember that alliance, okay?
The Rock.
Another thing is, it's called the Hasbach Memorandum. I've read it, it's a very interesting piece of work, but if you look at it, basically in this memorandum, in this meeting in the Reichschancellery, that's basically the German government inside the Reichstag, their parliament building, they basically talked about how they could start a war, where they would start the war, how they would expand, and what they would do. And so, a lot of people point back to this and say this is when Hitler really decided that he was going to move forward with war and started to become more specific in what he wanted to do. Some historians will disagree with this. Others, will say that no, there's a lot to it. And again, these are going to be the different schools of thought that you might have to talk about. We're going to talk about that soon when you get to your exam. And then he does the Anschluss. Do you remember what that was? That was the union of Germany with Austria. Remember, Austrians speak German. They speak a different dialect at points of German, but they're German people, and they have similarities. Hitler is an Austrian who's taken over Germany, okay? So that's part of that, and that was in that last, and that was forbidden by Versailles. Another thing that's going to happen is Hitler is going to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact. Yes, sir?
Sorry, wasn't also Anschluss part of Germany's, beginning plan to take Czechoslovakia?
Yes.
Okay.
Because what happens is they started to surround Czechoslovakia, which made it easier for them to put more pressure on the Czech government and so forth. So absolutely, absolutely. The Nazi-Soviet pact, this is going to shock the world because these are two ideologies who hate each other. I mean, hate each other. And everybody was shocked when they did it. Why do you think Hitler wanted to sign this pact with the Soviets?
Only has to deal with one side.
Correct.
Just a-
The Soviets aren't so much powerful, but Nick?
If he had to fight both the Soviets and he would have to, if the Soviets were in the fight, he would have to fight a two-fronted war, which is very difficult to do. So instead, by getting rid of the Russians, he only has to worry about one front.
Yeah, because then if it was a two-front, it would end up like World War I.
Absolutely. He wants to stay out of World War I's two-front war. If he doesn't have to worry about his east, he'll be able to concentrate specifically on his west.
Yep.
And he knows right now that the French have built the Maginot Line, so they're worried more about a defensive battle. If he can get the Russians to stay out of battle, then he's got, free reign. And the Soviets, for Stalin, he's thinking, this buys me more time to actually prepare my military. Because he has been, Stalin has been going through, and he's been basically purging his military generals because, again, he's kind of paranoid and he believes that everybody's out to get him. So you're my friend today, you're my enemy tomorrow, you're dead that afternoon, kind of a thing. So he's got to rebuild. What happens is, once he's got this pact in August, Hitler invades Poland, he comes in from the west, the Russians come in from the east. This was a secret agreement that they were going to divide Poland in half. And with that, they now have they share a border, but they're not worried because they have a pact not to fight. Okay? It's also known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because those were the two foreign ministers.
I will not remember that.
No, you won't. That's okay. And so as you can see here, this is a picture of basically what they did. So when they came into Poland, as you can see, the Germans pretty much came in from the west, a little bit from the north too, and the Russians came in from this area here. And so the Polish army, and then they were destroyed within 3 to 6 weeks. It was over for them. Now, what is appeasement, and why is appeasement important?
So appeasement is that you're trying to, relax or
Yes.
tension.
Relax tension. So I want you to think about it like this. And I'm being serious. Have you ever seen like a parent in the store with like a little kid, and the little kid like, I want the candy, I want the candy, I want the candy, and they're going on and on and on, and finally the parents are, take the candy, right?
Sounds like a true story.
Right, it does sound like a true story. I know somebody who did that. No, I'm joking. But having said that, sometimes you appease just to keep the peace. These people are coming out of World War I where you had millions of people killed. War is not popular. There's still a depression. People are trying to figure out what's going on. Appeasement cut across all political ideologies. It wasn't like the liberals were for it and the conservatives were against, or the conservatives were for it. Didn't matter if you were liberal or conservative. It was just one of those things where it just went across the whole spectrum, and especially in England. Okay? And so what happens here is, as they appeased Hitler, Hitler becomes more and more strong, or becomes stronger within Germany. Each time he did something, there were a number of military generals in Germany who were hoping that the West would stand up because they wanted to overthrow Hitler. But they were waiting for that moment. But every time he took that step and nothing happened, he became more popular at home. So he took a bigger step. And because of this, by the time the British and the French are going to stand up, it's just way too late. And the material resources he's going to get are going to be very important for him to be able to fight a war. So again, here's some of what I was just talking about. As you can see, they also believe Versailles was just way too harsh. Chamberlain, that's Neville Chamberlain. He's the prime minister who was a firm believer in appeasement, but he definitely took over some of the policies that were established by other British prime ministers. And basically what he was hoping is that the appeasement would also allow British time to rearm. And they will, but they won't be as ready as they should have been. Questions on this? And that's Neville Chamberlain there talking. He had just gotten off the plane from Germany, from Munich conference, and said, "This is peace in our time, peace with honor." And within a few months, that would be totally destroyed.
That's what we call irony.
Ebony and irony?
Irony. What did you say?
I think he resigned because of that.
No, he doesn't resign because of that. He will stay on. He will stay on through the beginning of World War II, and it'll be in the early stages of 1940 that the government is just so unpopular that he decides to walk away, and he knows Churchill is the man for the job. Because what happens is, and I won't get too detailed on this, but when Hitler turns towards Poland and says, "We want Danzig back, we want this area," the French and the British say, "Enough, we're going to defend you, Poland." Well, they said, "We're going to defend your independence, not your territorial independence." What does that mean? So when the Germans invaded, the French and the British didn't do much right away. They were supposed to declare war, but they didn't. And they said, "Well, Poland's still independent. They still have a government. They're still independent. Instead of being this big, they're just this big now." And the British people are like, "Yeah, nah, that's just not going to work." And eventually he'll be forced into the actual war. For the French, if the British aren't going to act, they're not acting. Even though they have this agreement with Czechoslovakia, they have this agreement with Poland, if the British don't act, we're not acting. That's our big brother right there. And then we go together or we don't go at all. And because of this, you know, again, they built a defense system. They won't act without the British. And basically, as they were looking at the whole thing from the West, they were like, well, is it okay if Hitler goes east and defeats possibly those communists over in Soviet Union? Wouldn't it be good for them to kind of like kill each other and then make each other weak, and then we can sweep in with democracy? So that's some of the stuff that's going on. Yes?
Yes, but also that would never happen because Germany and Russia made the treaty, so.
Correct, but you can still always hope. In the Pacific, here's some essay questions to consider. To what extent was Japan responsible for the war? You know, basically there's two historical debates out there. One was that, you know, they were there to liberate Asia from Western domination. And if you think about it, a lot of these areas were controlled. I mean, look, the French, the UK, the Dutch, the United States. So they were, you know, that's a reason. Another one was that Japan was there to create their own sphere of influence. right? So we're gonna take a look here at the Southeast Pacific. So, hi, welcome. So background here. To give you an idea of how Japan becomes a much more powerful nation, basically it's going to start with the Sino-Japanese. Do you know what Sino stands for?
Against. No. Together.
That's how you would say China. Sino-Japanese. So if you ever see that, that means Chinese and whatever war, okay? So they have this war, and basically, when they come out of this, the West is going to look at Japan and go, these people are powerful. They're almost equal to what we can do. We need to treat them differently than we've treated a lot of the other foreign nations that are especially over in the South Pacific. They started to dominate Korea, and then from there Japan is going to continue to spread its tentacles. All right? They also will get into an alliance with the British. Anglo means British, just in case you didn't know that. But what's really important here is this Russo-Japanese War. Japan fought Russia in 1904. Who's supposed to win? Russia. Russia's a European nation, even though a good portion of it's sitting in Asia. But it's a European power against an Asian, little island Asian nation. Those people are inferior to us. How could they defeat the Russians? Well, they did. Part of it had to do with the Russian government and their inability to fight. But when this happens, people are going to look at Japan differently, and Japan's going to start looking at itself even more differently. During the First World War, they will basically kind of be on the Allies' side. You okay?
Yeah.
Okay, they're going to be on the Allies' side, and what they're hoping through this whole thing is to get more possessions, especially once the war ends. They want all of the German possessions that are in the Far East. That's what they're hoping for, especially at Versailles. And another thing that's going to be important is because, again, Japan and Russia had a fight back in 1904, like 15 years earlier. During the Russian Revolution, the Japanese are going to support the white forces. You had the White Army against the Red Army. The Red Army is the Bolsheviks, which will become the Communists, Lenin, Stalin,
So it's Russia.
etc. So they went in there and they actually supported these forces against the Bolsheviks. That's also going to make them a little bit of an enemy for the Russians moving forward.
During the war, from what you mentioned before, that just the size of Russia itself and how more eastern isn't as populated as closer to the Europe.
Right, from about the Urals west, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just it. So, when you look at those vast wastelands of the Siberian, desert, if you want to call it, it's the steppe out there. Yeah, I mean, Russia's a massively huge country, rich in resources, but their communist nation and their lack of having real capitalism didn't allow them to really take advantage of the resources they had. Like, for example, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. During the very beginnings of the Russian Revolution, so many millions of people starved to death in Russia, not because they didn't have the food, they couldn't get the food to market. A lot of the food was sitting on trains, they just couldn't get it there. They didn't have the capacity. Stalin's going to do everything he can to make them more modern, and he did. But still, they probably could have become more modern more quickly under a different system. If we look here, let me see what I want to talk about here. Again, coming back to Versailles, Japan is looking to gain or take the territories that the Germans used to have. They also want to be seen as a racial equal on the world stage. They will get some different areas within China, some of the colonies of Germany, but basically they're going to come out as the economic power because there's nobody to rival them in any way, okay? And this is why they had that Washington conference where they had the British and the Americans especially talking about the size of navies. That's why that treaty came out. We talked about that last time. Maybe I'll have you sit back there next time and do this for me. 1920s, basically Japan became more democratic. So even though they're looking to expand, they also became more modern in the Western sense. They basically are going to embrace Western culture, their architecture, music, fashion. Many of their prime ministers are pro-democracy, pro-freedom, maybe a little bit more progressive. But over time, that is going to go away. And what's going to happen is you're going to have economic crisis from the Great Depression. And then eventually that's going to lead more to more or less a military coup where the military powers within Japan take over, okay? And this will happen here in the early 30s. And we've talked a little bit about this. This is where they enter Manchuria. And basically, as they're doing this, even though the League of Nations is what?
It doesn't have any value or value.
It's not doing anything. It's still making people go, we're not liking what we're seeing over there. Now, even though I'm not stepping in right now to do anything, I have possessions over in those areas. I need to be thinking, what might they be doing in the future that I need to prepare for? So that's what we're looking at here. Again, now we're going to have a serious war between China and Japan in 1937, also known as the Rape of Nanking or Nanjing. It's not so, well, there was a series, there were a lot of rapes to it. I mean, it's really tragic. I mean, and I'm being serious, I don't say that lightly. But basically, Japan is going to come in and just devastate the people of this area. And I mean, not only are they going to devastate the army, they're going to devastate the civilian population, a lot of the women, etc. Use your own imaginations there, okay? Why are some of the reasons why they're doing this? Well, part of it is Japan needs raw material. Without it, they can't have a war machine. You can't fight wars. You can't fight battles. One of the reasons why Hitler's going to move more towards Stalingrad during the Barbarossa invasion, because he needed oil to run his war machine, okay? And so basically, what's happening is, as all of this is going on, the United States and the West are looking at this thinking, what are we going to do? Is this going to be a problem moving forward? How do we deal? We have interest over there. We've got the Philippines. We've got Guam. Who controls Australia? Who controls this? How are we going to deal with this expanding Japanese army and so forth? So this is what's going on here. And Japan is basically saying, we have a right to do this. You have Europe, we have the East. Leave us alone. And in a sense, I mean, they could make the argument, if you think about what the Europeans had done by going around the world and showing their superiority. So as Japan is doing certain things in this war and so forth, what's going to happen is the United States is going to go ahead and react. They're not proactive, they're reactive. And part of this is, as Japan goes in and takes the Burma Road, we will ban their scrap iron. Why is that important?
Can't build guns, vehicles.
Right? Military materiel, you can't, your war machine, you can't build it. Then General Hideki Tojo is going to come in. And basically, he is going to be a believer that the only way Japan can get power moving forward is through war, expansion, through military. And so he's going to have this mindset to go ahead and to expand. And this is where it's going to eventually lead to the planning of Pearl Harbor. Because what they're going to hope to do is, as the war, because remember, it's 1940, war has already been going on almost a full year in Europe. As Europe is dealing with their own crisis, do they have time to deal with the crisis over in the Far East? No. The only country that's not at war, that's major in the West, is the United States. So if we can hit the United States hard and knock them out of the war, and not even give them a chance to get into a war, who's going to stop us? And that's where the decisions for Pearl Harbor are going to come in. That is their thinking. Don't ask me what I did there. Oh, there's that, and that's Tojo. I don't know why that did the spin like that, but that's cool. So, response. What's going to happen, because these are the three main countries that are over in the Far East, they're going to come up with a total trade embargo. They're going to basically say all of the stuff that Japan needs to run its war machine, we're going to stop sending to them. It makes sense. So what happens here is they are moving more, and this is Tojo, moving more and more into the only way we're going to get what we want is if we use force. And hence, on December 7th, 1941, and by the way, do you know why they write it like this? We do December 7th, right? This is the European way of doing it, okay? So, it's, if you get a British person grading your exam, that might make them happy.
So they were thinking that if Japan just attacks that one little island, that the U.S. would now go to war with them, or that
Well,
it seemed like they were asking for war.
they were, but I want you to understand this, okay? And it's a good question. Here's Pearl Harbor. In Pearl Harbor is the majority of the Western or the Pacific Fleet for the United States. If Japan could come in unknown, surprise attack, and knock out this fleet, by the time the Americans can rebuild the fleet, get back on their feet, and move, it's going to be so long that Japan should be so entrenched where they are that there shouldn't be any worry about the Americans coming in and taking it over. That was the thinking. Because at the same time, they're going to invade as they hit us at Pearl Harbor. They're going into all the places, into the Philippines, into Guam, into, eventually they're going to try to go into Australia and stuff. They're going after all of these places. But what happened is, there were a number of ships at Pearl Harbor that day, but there were a number that were out to sea, which has led people to think, did FDR, the American government, know that the attack was possibly going to come? So they got some ships out, but this was their prelude to be able to get into the war that they really wanted to get into.
For their plans on entrenching on all the islands and the homeland, you can kind of see that even if Pearl Harbor didn't do as much as they proposed, that they still entrenched all the way through.
No, absolutely. They were going to entrench, but what they were hoping is that by the time the Americans would get prepared and have the military or the naval might to fight, it just wouldn't be worth it. They would realize it was like a dead-end street. And you're absolutely right. And that's why we'll go to island hopping. Instead of fighting for every little island and dying, we just will jump from island to island to island. But that's a picture from Pearl Harbor that has been colorized. That's a real photo. It's just been colorized, which I think is pretty cool. So, what do I want to do here? So, what we have here is how is Japan and Germany, how are they going to work together? Well, they had started to become more and more linked in the 1930s as they had common interests with each other and common enemies at one point, for Japan being the Russians and for Germany, in a sense, even though they made the pact with Russia, Hitler knew they were going to go to war. What happens here is, and this is probably one of the dumbest things that happens, is after the United States declares war on Japan, 2 days later, 3 days later, December 7th, 8th, we declare war. December 10th, Hitler declared war on the United States because, in his words, great nations don't wait for war to be brought. They declare war. It was dumb because still at this point, Americans could argue the following. Hey, why are we going to war in Europe? Japan attacked us. Hitler didn't do anything. What are we doing? And because of that, they would have made an argument. But once Hitler declared war on us, that allowed us to take our resources and send them to both directions.
And also the fact that Japan attacked the major ports for Pacific ships and not where Europe is in the winter.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then what's going to happen here is eventually Japan and Russia, because Operation Barbarossa, which we're going to talk about, Germany invades Russia, and so we've got that. So here we go. Just trying to see where I am because I'm doing this a lot faster than I ever would, so I'm just trying to catch where I am here. So how does, what is the responsibility of the US in the Pacific? Obviously, one of the things that we were trying to do is we were trying to contain Japan a little bit more in in the Pacific, and, kind of keep them at bay, not let them be as powerful as they wanted. We also did some things here where we did like the National Origins Act, and what that did in the United States, which is gonna fuel propaganda, is we said, we will only allow X amount of people to immigrate from a country based on a percentage of people who were here in like 1880. Well, there weren't a lot of Japanese in 1880 in the United States. So if you can only get a small percentage of a small group, that allows very few to come in. And because of that, that's going to fuel their propaganda. We don't like what they were doing with in Manchuria. And basically, at this point here, Roosevelt's going to give a Four Freedoms speech. And basically he's saying, look, we are against military dictatorships, we're against fascism, so we're against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And that's going to be in January of 41, and basically a year later, what's going to happen? Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. Am I going too fast here? Are you guys about done? Want me to do, let me stop here, because I could do this one, and then let me just stop here for today, okay, because I think that's a good place. Let me just see one thing. Yeah, let me just finish this one here, because that would be the last question to look at, okay? So the USA sought to contain Japan. So again, as you can see here, as we're looking at this, probably the biggest impact of everything that was happening is when we sanctioned the Japanese. Once we kind of looked at them and said, we're done. We're going to use our naval might in the Pacific to slow you down. And when we slow down your expansion, you won't get the rubber that you need for tires and things that you need to build. You're not going to get the iron ore that you need to build your war machine. You're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. And when we do this, this to some degree could be a provocation against the Japanese. So last question would be here. So who do you think would be held most responsible for the war in the Pacific, the US or Japan? So the reason why I put that question there for you is to start thinking, because when you write your essay, there's no right or wrong answer. It's all in how you report it, and you write it, okay? So any questions on this today? I'm sorry, I know this is so much information, isn't it? Is it an information overload? A little bit?
Well,
Oh, my.
just